So I think most of you know Neil Gifford. He is our commission's lead scientist. His title is Conservation Director. He provides oversight for all of our management and research activities. He's authored several scientific publications on different aspects of Pine Barrens conservation, and he's a licensed USGS master birdbander. And tonight, he's going to talk about conservation ethics in an urban preserve. So thank you all for joining us. And Neil, whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
Your photos here. I can't see my slides. Well, good evening, everyone. And thanks for volunteering, first of all. And thanks for joining us on a Thursday evening to talk about the work we're doing in the preserve, but specifically to get into a little bit of the ethics of it. I'm hoping that this will be interactive, that you will ask me questions throughout the course of the presentation. Now I can only see you, Jody. That's interesting. Oh, there's it.
I was muted. I see your screen.
Okay, and this is, so can you see, I'm sorry, can you see what I see as far as the slide of you all on the side, or do you only see my presentation?
I think we can each individually control that. So I see a grid of people, but I also see, it says sharing your screen.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. So this presentation is a little bit different. It's not just, it is a little bit about the nuts and bolts and the science of what we do. But I put this together actually on an invitation from a SUNY Albany professor who teaches a graduate level course in environmental ethics. And I thought, well, that's different. And so when Jody was and it went really well when I did it for them. And when Jody invited me to offer a presentation tonight, I thought that this might be something a little bit different. So I'm hoping that the ethics part of this will really come from the questions that you all have about the work that we do, both the management and the research part of things. But I wanted to start with a quote from Aldo Leopold. He's kind of he's considered kind of the godfather, the father of restoration ecology, and he's really the one that, more than conservation biology, but he really looked at restoration and ecological restoration from a systems perspective, and he was really one of the first people to do that and end up turning that into its own branch of conservation science. So if you have not read the Sand County Almanac, I would highly recommend it. I've read it, I don't know, a bunch of times. It's one of my favorite go-to conservation books. But one of the last chapters in that book is called The Land Ethic, and he stated that the land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soil, water, plants, and animals, and collectively the land. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in the scope of what we're doing at the Pine Bush. But from its inception to present day, the Albany Pine Bush Preserve is really a case study in aspiring for the land ethic espoused by Aldo Leopold in the Sand County Almanac. The protection and management of this globally rare and fire-dependent ecosystem continues to both test and showcase how we attempt to balance the needs and sustainability of the whole community. And by that, I mean people and nature, in an all-American urban landscape. In this presentation, I hope to outline what we do, why we do it, and how we know it's working as a precursor to discussing with you all the ethical pros and cons of some of the very heavy-handed and somewhat controversial work that we do in the preserve to try and preserve that quote-unquote thing that Aldo Leopold defined as right. So I'm going to breeze through the background because you probably know most of this. But I'm going to start with background, talk a little bit about our adaptive management and how we know if it's working, and what more we want to know, what more we need to know, and then hopefully to have a discussion about some of the conservation ethics. So Pine Barrens are this archipelago of habitat islands across the Northeast. They're a suite of globally rare, isolated ecological communities that are all fire dependent, but all different from each other. They're similar, but they're different. And all of them are very important for biodiversity and provide habitat for a suite of wildlife species in particular that are declining almost everywhere. And if you think about these habitats, many of us, if you have an ecological science background, learned about early successional habitats, which are somewhat ephemeral they're disturbance dependent, and on a decent soil with good, with a decent site with good soil, these habitats might last for 10 to 20 years at best. Right? There's a disturbance, there's a windstorm, a fire, some sort of disturbance, and everything recovers from that and regrows to eventually become a forest again. Pine barrens are different. They have served as these early successional or young forest habitats. They're not a grassland. They're not a forest. They're not a forest. There's something in between, and they've persisted at these sites for thousands of years in that condition as kind of this open canopied shrubby grassland or grassy shrubland, depending on how you want to look at it. And they've all declined considerably, and they're all very much conservation reliant, meaning that their survival depends on us managing them to keep them healthy and to provide habitat for a variety of rare plants and animals. In the pine bush specifically, there are two rare communities, the pitch pine scrub oak barrens, and these G and S ranks, they relate to rarity. So the S is state and the G is global. So an S1 means there are fewer than 5 known examples in the world, in the state. And a G2 means there are fewer than 20 known examples in the world. Pine barrens, vernal ponds are the other globally rare ecological community in the preserve. And collectively, they support a huge wealth of biodiversity. And in particular, for their size, they support an awful lot of rare species. Wildlife in particular, that the state and federal wildlife agencies have classified as species of greatest conservation need. And that term is really kind of self-explanatory. It means that these, without our help, these species are likely to be listed as threatened or endangered and ultimately become extinct. The pine bush is also among all of the, fewer than 20 pine barrens in the world. The pine bush is unique. For one, you've been there, you've seen the hills, but those hills are actually part of this massive paraglacial dune field. If you stripped away the vegetation, it would look like the Sahara Desert. The pine bush is the only pine barrens that has this. In particular, the size, the magnitude, and the number of dunes that we have. It's that dune field that helped the preserve be listed as a national natural landmark in 2014. I already mentioned that it's globally rare. It's also the type locality for the Karner blue butterfly. So that means the Karner blue butterfly was first identified in this place, from this place. And the way it's described, the original specimens are described in museums, is from the Albany pine bush. Karner was actually a little rail stop in Colony back in the early 1900s. And the other thing you need to know is that the pine bush is a tiny fragmented remnant of its former self. The pine bush covered at least 25,000 acres originally. Today, there are fewer than 6,000 acres left, a little over half of which are protected as part of the preserve. So one of our goals and one of the first ethical questions is how much is enough and what are the consequences of setting aside land and adding it to the preserve? Again, it's all about balance. If you're purely into conservation, you would think it's great. If, however, you're into economic development and property rights and lots of those kinds of issues, there are other questions that come to play when you think about the ethics of growing a preserve. So the preserve is the darkest green color on this map. And you can see it's fragmented by major roads. So you've got the Interstate 90 running kind of northwest to southeast. The Northway is on the east end, running more kind of north-south. You got 155 cutting through the middle. Then lots of other roads and development, and even amongst the preserve itself, it's fragmented. But then even where we have contiguous open space, like that whole northern section where all of that lime green color is, those are pieces of remnant pine bush that we want to see added to the preserve. So we're still working on growing the preserve. It is very much a work in progress. And it was threatened, of course, by all of this development, and fragmented, and threatened by a lack of fire, and threatened by invasive species because of all of this edge. You chop up, you take a big block of ice and you chop that thing up into a bunch of little pieces, and all of that ice is gonna melt a lot faster. The same thing kind of holds true in conservation. You take one large contiguous piece of open space, You chop it up with all these roads and developments, and you create lots of edge, and it starts to dissolve. So it's not as healthy as it used to be. To try and compensate for that, in 1988, the New York State Legislature and the governor created the preserve and the commission. And the commission is basically all of the municipal state agencies that have skin in the game, and then the Nature Conservancy and 4 private citizens appointed by the governor. And the law that created the preserve and the commission gives us kind of our legal mandate. So one of the things that we weigh in thinking about whether or not what we're doing is right is ultimately we bounce it against that legal mandate that kind of sets the stage for what we're supposed to be doing in the preserve. And that's New York State Environmental Conservation Law, Article 46. And the law and our management plan kind of to help us define our goals for the preserve. And they're principally twofold. One, of course, is ecological. And the preserve is principally set up for its ecological, for environmental conservation. And to protect the ecosystem dynamics, and specifically fire. And the law is very specific. It says we're going to create the preserve and we're going to manage it with fire. And we're going to try and protect all of those plants and animals that depend on that ecosystem. But there are also programmatic goals. And this and juggling all of this also requires us to think about conservation ethics, because we're balancing what the ecosystem needs with our own need to protect ourselves from uncontrolled wildfires. So programmatic goals include managing fuels to reduce the chances for uncontrollable wildfires, but also managing the preserve so that people can use it. So we have a trail system, we have education and outreach programs. We make the preserve accessible to people like yourselves. And that requires balancing, and that requires, to some degree, a good deal of ethics. But it's not just at the preserve. So I want to talk a little bit about our work on the ground. And one of the first things we do that is somewhat controversial is that despite having a preserve that's fragmented, right? We don't have, as I said, one preserve. We kind of have 5 currently, and then some outlier pieces. So you've got, if you think about it in quadrants here, you got Rap Road down to the southeast, Conor Barron's East, Conor Barron's West, and Kings Road. You got this whole big chunk out at the Great Dune and Madison Avenue Pinelands and Blueberry Hill. So we really have 4 or 5 big chunks of the preserve. It's fragmented. Then on top of that, we're also fragmenting it because we have to have management units that allow us to put fire on the ground. And generally they're less than 50 acres in size. So we're taking what's left of the open space that we've protected, and then we're chopping that up with trails and fire breaks to create these management units, which has consequences. And then, of course, you're familiar with the management we do. So I cut a lot of this out of this presentation for you all. Of course, we're trying to put fire on the ground, and fire in Pine Barrens is like hydrology in a wetland. Without it, the system stops working. So we need to be putting fire on the ground to maintain and keep the Pine Barrens healthy and provide habitat for all those rare wildlife species. But fire was kept out of this place for decades, better part of 50 years. So the restoration phase of things means we have to go in pretty heavy-handed. So we're using fire, but we're also mowing a lot of the scrub oak. Some of this work is going to start next week. We're thinning both native and non-native forests. So it's one thing to cut and remove invasive black locust clones. That's an easier pill to swallow for some folks because it's a weed, right? The system's out of whack. It's unhealthy. We're pulling the weeds, getting rid of the invasives, trying to restore barrens. But we also have an awful lot of native forest that has developed over the last 40 to 50 years due to a lack of fire. So restoring the barrens and providing a large enough healthy pine barrens for all those rare wildlife means that we're even going into native forests of oak and pine and liberating pitch pine and oak trees to recreate or restore that open canopied structure that you see at the top here in this fire picture. The pine bush really should be this open canopied woodland where you've got scattered pitch pine and oak trees with an understory of scrub oak and prairie grasses. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, I guess you can. We also use herbicides, right, which are controversial no matter how you look at it. Or using herbicides is controversial. For us, it's a tool of last resort. And again, we're using herbicides not only to get rid of non-native invasive plants, but in some cases, we're using herbicides to thin overabundant native plants that we can't thin and manage any other way. If we weren't able to thin scrub oak thickets and create the open space that the grasses and wildflowers need, we wouldn't be able to create habitat for corner blue butterflies. So there's kind of a hint at the ecosystem puzzle, the dynamics of this system, and how the ethics come into play in the decisions we make. Because hopefully, well, I'm hoping that you will chew on this and we'll get it at the end. Particularly as you think about climate change, we're putting smoke in the air, we're cutting trees, right? We're altering this system to try and protect and restore something that's globally rare and unique. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that climate change isn't happening. So I'm hoping that you'll ask me questions about that later on. And of course, we're doing a lot, as you know, we're doing a lot of seeding, not only to try and recover the endangered corner blue butterfly population, but also to restore a lot of these sites that were overrun with non-native invasive plants due to a lack of fire and development. So we've burned a lot. You can see here over time, we've burned. I want you to hopefully see two things here. One, that this graph has an increasing trend. So the number of acres we burn each year, and in this case, this is hectares using metrics. But you see that it goes up considerably over the last 5-6 years. Tyler Briggs has done an amazing job of getting a lot more fire on the ground, which is exactly what we needed to do. But also notice the transition in the colors. And when I talk about dormant season and growing season fire, look at these two pictures. So dormant season is just starting now, really, right? The trees and bushes, all the woody stuff, all the plants are basically dormant and asleep. And what we're burning is principally dead vegetation, dead leaves and grass from the previous year. And we're doing that in the fall, winter, early spring before green up. But as you can see here with this blue-green color, we also utilize prescribed fire in the growing season. So think about that. In the dormant season, animals are hibernating, birds have migrated, most of the insects are in some sort of a safe place, whether they're eggs buried in the soil or up in the vegetation. But things aren't nesting. You don't have birds nesting. You don't have corner blue butterflies and other insects out flying around. When you're burning in the growing season, we're burning while plants are green and growing and when animals are doing their thing. So I'm hoping that you will think about that and ask me some questions about how we deal with that and not only justify it, but also manage and mitigate some of those impacts to keep the whole system working. This is just another shot of fire, growing season fire. You can see here why we need fire breaks, why we fragment the preserve. You can see the landfill in this bigger picture in the background. The city of Albany, the high rises are behind it. You're looking at the thruway here on the right, and the road running left to right is Route 155. If you know the preserve, this unit is called Friendly because we wanted to give it a nice happy name next to the thruway because it's an incredibly difficult and hair-raising place to put fire on the ground. And there's Tyler Briggs in the lower left, and you got Amanda Dillon there on the torch. And then you can see what's left afterwards. It's the site burned well. When you see white ash like this, that means it was a hot fire that really consumed all that woody debris that we wanted to burn up. But also note, right, it's kind of obvious, put fire on the ground, you're going to put smoke in the air. So again, I'm hoping you'll ask me some questions about smoke and climate change. And over time, we've burned a lot. We've burned now 1,200 hectares. Overall, the whole footprint is about 600 hectares, which is about 1,400 acres. So the footprint of what we've actually burned on the ground is 1,400 acres. And we have, over time, some of those management units have been burned multiple times. So the overall total number of acres or hectares is about twice that. So we've burned about almost 3,000 acres since we started putting fire on the ground in 1991. That's Steve's work, Jody, because I can't use English units when I go to conferences.
Well, good job to Steve.
You're welcome.
Oh, he's there. Hey.
It looks amazing.
And part of why we do it this way is that we're trying to mimic what fire would do historically. Despite what you have seen, if you're familiar with the movie Bambi or any other, most of the news coverage right now from out west or almost any Hollywood projection of wildland fire is that it burns everything from stem to stern, kills everything in between, And nothing could be farther from the truth for healthy systems that are managed with fire the way fire used to run. Fire would happen here historically almost every year, and some sites would, someplace in the pine bush would burn every year, and the average fire frequency for any given spot is 10 to 13 years. So any one of these management units historically, pick a spot, it would have burned once a decade, if you want to think about it that way. So part of what we're trying to do with our prescribed fire management is not just get the right kind of fire on the ground to get the right effects, but also to recreate that shifting mosaic.
Hey, Neil, you're gravelly. Can you fix that?
No. Is it any better, Jody?
Not yet.
Yeah, I don't know why it does
Because you were fine, and then all of a sudden it just switched.
Yeah, it's done this before on me. Hold on.
Still there as of now.
Any better?
Nope.
Son of a gun. You know what it is? It's just like, I have to change my speakers. How was that?
Still there.
Well, at least now I know what to do. I have to mount. Bear with me here for a second. Is that any better?
That is better. Is everybody else good? Can you give me a thumbs up if it's better for you? Everybody else hearing Neil okay? Neil,
No.
For a second.
Yep, I'll have to be speaking, but I'm seeing thumbs up. Thumbs up. Thank you.
Yep. Okay.
I had to change my speaker setup, which was
no, weird. That's much better. Sorry to interrupt you.
That's all right. No, we learned that recently. Thanks, Steve, for telling me that I sounded like a dialect again. So what we're trying to do is recreate the shifting mosaic on the landscape. If you think about the way land managers and wetlands manage hydrology and flooding cycles to try and maximize the health of those wetland systems, we're doing something similar in pine barrens, but with fire. It's not just about putting fire on the ground, but it's putting the right type of fire on the ground at the right time to get the desired effect. What we're really doing is managing fire effects. In the fire world, we consider ourselves fire effects managers, not fire managers. It's not really about the fire. It's about getting the fire to do what we need it to do. So ultimately, we want to know if we're meeting our goals. So this too gets into ethics and somewhat a little bit of controversy. So we look at whether or not we're meeting our goals. I pigeonholed this into 4 different ways. So we look at fire and management effects that I just talked about, and I'll show you a slide of that. We're looking at the distribution and amount of the thing we're trying to protect, right? So inland pitch pine scrub oak barrens is that thing we're trying to make healthy and whole again. So we look at, are we improving the distribution, how much we have, and the quality of the barrens that we have relative to where we started. We do the same thing for wildlife. One of the unique things about pine barrens management, not just here, but across the Northeast, is that by the time any of us started managing these sites, they were so heavily degraded that none of us had a high quality site that we could go and look at and say, that's the thing, that's what we need to be managing toward. But fortunately, what we do have is a lot of good historical information about the wildlife that were in these systems, what species were here, and in what kinds of abundances. So a lot of restoration ecology is reverse engineering. It's looking at the conditions that those wildlife species need. In particular, there's a suite of species that really depend on pine barrens. The Carner blue, obviously, inland barrens, buck moths. There are a number of reptiles and amphibians like hognose snakes, and a number of birds. So instead of relying on just one species, we utilize a number of these wildlife species of greatest conservation need that specialize on barrens and look at whether or not our management is influencing how many of them we have, the size of their populations, and where they are. Because they too, their populations, their abundance and distribution should be going up if we're managing the preserve appropriately. So we use them as kind of a surrogate, as an indicator. You can almost think of them like if you're going to a doctor and he or she is looking at your symptoms, right? With us looking at the wildlife, we're looking at the symptoms of a functioning ecosystem. As much as the wildlife are cool by themselves, we use them in that way. So only one data slide, really. I know it's late on a Thursday evening. We do look at fire and management effects. So these two graphs here, we did this example. The pictures are showing you, we took an 8-acre unit, cut it in half, mowed the whole thing, burned 4 acres, and then compared them. Okay, that was the experiment we did before we started doing growing season mowing and burning in the early 2000s. And this chart on the upper left, this is about habitat structure. And you can see how the gray circles largely cluster together and the blue triangles largely cluster together. That's because those symbols represent mowing only versus the mowing and burning. And this was a desired effect. We wanted to manipulate the structure of the ecosystem. And this carries to this chart down below, looking at the structural attributes we were measuring. So in the mow and burn, we pretty much eliminated the leaf litter. We eliminated the duff, which is that organic matter below the leaf litter where you can no longer distinguish what it is. We exposed a lot of bare ground. And that led to some changes in the grass and forb cover. And those are things we wanted to do. But it's not enough, particularly when you're trying something new and controversial with a management technique. So we treated 8 acres as an experiment, studied it before we took that technique to scale in the preserve. But one of the things we did not want to do was dramatically alter the species composition. And that's what this other plot graph is here, where the circles and triangles are intermingled. Basically, that's telling us the plant species composition didn't change, which is the effect we wanted. So we kept all the plant species we wanted, but we altered the structure. And this is just a quantitative way of looking at whether or not we met those goals. Then once we realized what we could do with this technique, we then took it to scale. And you've probably seen some of that work that Tyler has done with burning in the growing season after sites are mowed. So we're also looking at the distribution and amount of the barrens communities themselves. So pine barrens is this generic term that's made up of 4 ecological communities for our purposes. And you can think about these as successional variants at the earliest stage. And this is that picture on the left there is 3 or 4 years after a black locust clone was removed. So we end up with these native grasslands full of lupin and grasses, not a lot of trees, not much shrub cover. Over time, we can hopefully manage those with fire to turn into pitch pine scrub oak barrens. We want some pitch pine scrub oak thickets and a little bit of pitch pine scrub oak forest. And if you look at the dates here on the bottom, you can see the relative amounts of those ecological communities we had when we started in 1990. And then what we had at the last time we did an analysis of the whole landscape using satellite imagery. And you can see there's some pretty dramatic shifts. We had an awful lot of forest historically. We still have a lot of forest, but now we have a lot more pitch pine scrub oak barrens and successional and sandplain grassland. And the scrub oak thickets is something that we're still trying to define. One of those questions we have longer term is how much of barrens versus thicket do we need in this landscape? We really don't know that yet. It seems like most of the rare species need the open barrens. Then over time, we manage these sites with fire. And depending on the fire frequency, if we wait longer to burn, we should be seeing some of these grasslands turn into barrens and ultimately thickets. If we take barrens and thickets and burn them frequently or burn them real hot, we can set them back to successional grasslands. If we leave thickets alone, they'll turn into pitch pine oak forest. If we go into pitch pine oak forest and burn it frequently and do some thinning work, we can set that back to these other successional variants. But all of this is to say, part of the ethics of what we're doing is we don't want just one of these ages of pine bush, of pine barrens. We don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. We still don't know how much of each of these communities we need necessarily. But the idea is by having each of these successional variants on the landscape, we'll end up increasing the insurance that we're going to have barrens in the long term. Hopefully that makes sense, but feel free to ask me questions about it as we go through. And then, of course, we have specialized wildlife that we have to manage for because it's endangered. And really, not only is the Karner blue endangered, but the endangerment of the Karner blue was the biggest symptom of the problem in pitch pine scrub oak barrens health and oak savannas in the upper Midwest. So we still don't fully know what Corner blue butterfly's ecological role is, ecological niche, and how it makes the system tick. But the fact that the corner blues declined by over 99% across their range and in New York State told us an awful lot about the health of these globally rare ecosystems. They were pretty sick. So one of our goals, of course, is to get the cardinal blue recovered. Hunters exist in the Northeast and in the Pine Barrens, in the upper Midwest, in oak savanna habitats. Their range used to be much, much larger, and now they're relegated to these 13 stippled polygons that are on this map. And one of the things I want you to note is that east of the Great Lakes, we're at Glacial Lake Albany. There's four remnant metapopulations left within Glacial Lake Albany. So our genetics here, part of preserving biodiversity is not just preserving species, which is the easiest thing sometimes for us to think about, but it's also about preserving genetics. So the genetics of our conures here are a little bit different, and this research has been done, than the genetics out west. So even if they had millions of cardinal blues in Michigan and Wisconsin, preserving cardinal blues in New York means that we're preserving those genetics as much as we're also helping preserve the animal. I'm going to assume you guys know cardinal life stage, but there's 2 broods a year. They overwinter as eggs. No life stage of cardinals can survive fire, yet they only live in places that burn frequently. As adult butterflies, they live 3 to 5 days and typically don't fly more than a couple hundred yards from where they hatched. So it is crazy. This is the beauty of ecosystems and ecology. Here you have an animal that lives in habitats that depend on fire, but no life stage can survive fire. But again, that's that shifting mosaic we talked about earlier is how that all works. And I already talked about fire. And recovering conures here really required us to do all this restoration work, but also do an awful lot of planting. If you can see these pinkish blobs on this map, those are the little tiny remnant patches of lupin we had left in the preserve by the time we started managing. There were about 9 sites that totaled 13 acres. All of the green you see on this map, that's the 700 acres of lupin that we've planted in the preserve, really since about 2000. And that was step 1 in trying to recover our population of conures. But as we talked about earlier, the preserve is really fragmented. So again, this was somewhat controversial and the ethics of this were questioned. We captured first brood females, held them in captivity, literally in solo cups, in plastic solo cups on a lupin leaf. And during their lifetime, they spent the rest of their life in a lab in a solo cup laying eggs on a lupin leaf. In the lab, they might live as long as 10 to 15 days. And then those eggs were reared out and fed lupin in the lab until we got pupa, the chrysalis. The chrysalises came back to us at the Discovery Center, where the butterflies eclosed in the animal care room and were then distributed in this restored habitat across the preserve. And so that all sounds really heavy-handed, and those poor animals, we're putting them in cages. We're taking females out of the wild, throwing them in a cup. And some people may think, well, it's an insect, but it's still a living creature. Putting it in a solo cup for it to lay the rest of its eggs, it then dies. And then all of those caterpillars are raised in captivity. So there's a lot of conservation ethics to think about with all of that. But our remnant populations were too small. Our landscape was too fragmented by roads and forests that the butterflies couldn't cross. So the only way for us to effectively get butterflies into all this habitat and rebuild the population here was to jumpstart things. So we called it accelerated colonization. And there in that top photo, you can see Dylan with those white plastic nets. And each one of those has a few hundred butterflies in it. So we did this. You can see on the graph here, the different colors represent the years when we released butterflies. We stopped in 2015. Every one of these sites that we released at, and we only released at these sites in each year, each of them persisted and then started colonizing other nearby sites. So basically, once we had seeded every section of the preserve, every piece of the preserve, we stopped torturing butterflies and let them persist on their own. And that's twofold. One, we can't do that forever. So that's a short-term tool for jumpstarting and resetting things. but really they need to be able to do it on their own. So did that work? Boy, did it. So I'm going to move all of your beautiful faces so I can see my slide here. This graph has a lot going on. Thanks to Dr. Campbell. Thank you, Steve. So one of the things I want you to notice are these blue bars represent the area that we survey each year from 2007 through 2020. And it went up over time because we created more habitat. We weren't counting the butterflies we released, so that's an important caveat. We were only counting butterflies at those sites a year later. So we knew they were the result of nature, not the result of us dumping butterflies out there. And it dropped a little bit in 2020 because with COVID, we couldn't hire seasonals. So Steve, Dylan, and I, and Tyler were the ones out there counting butterflies, and we just couldn't hit them all. So we reduced the area we surveyed this year. The red dots are that first brood of butterflies in May, June. The blue dots are the second brood of butterflies in July each year. And you can see we started off with fewer than 1,000. And then in 2013, it finally popped up above this minimum federal recovery threshold of 3,000 butterflies. And this is using statistics and sampling to come up with population estimates. And since 2013, the population has stayed well above that minimum threshold that the Fed said we needed to have a recovered population. It has to be above 3,000 in 4 to 5 years to be considered recovered. But you also need more than one subpopulation. You got to have multiple subpopulations and have them connected so that if a fire comes through and burns one site, there are butterflies nearby that can colonize that lupin when it pops back up. That's how butterflies naturally existed in this landscape. And you can see here, these pie graphs are showing you that over time, we went from basically one subpopulation. In 2013, we had 4 that were really contributing to these numbers. In 2019, 2020, we're up to basically 7 there. And we actually have 8 subpopulations in the preserve. We just can't sample in all of them. The other crazy thing is that, so we had a peak in 2015 of about 18,000 butterflies. Since then, the population has fluctuated, but stayed well above that recovery threshold. And despite surveying less area this year, apparently we set the table, and hunters are responding to 2 things principally. One is habitat. The other is weather. Weather and climate largely drives insect populations. So basically, we set the buffet, and then the weather conditions were good, and we saw a population explosion this year that we did not anticipate. And Steve's estimate just for the area that we surveyed was over 46,000 butterflies in the second brood of 2020, which is, you know, as biologists, we look at that as a double-edged sword. We say that obviously that's fantastic. We have lots of butterflies. The population here isn't really as threatened with extinction as it used to be. But if you look at the magnitude of that change, thankfully this year, the magnitude of that change was positive. It could just have likely been negative. And we could go from 15,000 to a couple hundred if the weather is really, really bad. Part of the reason we have so many sites across the preserve with butterflies in all of them is to try and reduce the likelihood. Again, it's an insurance policy. You don't want all your eggs in one basket. So we have almost 60 sites now with butterflies scattered across the preserve. So the likelihood of all of them going extinct in any given year is a lot less than it used to be. But this is a great indicator that our work is actually working. And so some of the ethics that I wanted to think about and talk about when it comes to burning an endangered species is that, as you can see from this picture, this is a May 20th prescribed fire in the Kings Road Barrens, now called the Truax Barrens. It was a maintenance fire. We've pretty much restored this site, and now we're just putting fire in there to keep it healthy. So we use a lower intensity, lower severity fire. And you can see the fire actually burned around big lupin patches. And those lupin patches are scattered all across this 25-acre management unit. And those lupin patches that didn't burn had butterflies in them. So even though we burned that habitat, and we burned awful lot of lupin, we killed an awful lot of carnary blue butterflies. We also had a lot of refugia within burn units. And as a rule, we don't burn more than a third of a site that supports butterflies in a year. and we don't burn adjacent thirds in consecutive years. So basically we try and leave refugia. Fire comes through, burns up a bunch of lupin, kills a bunch of butterflies. Butterflies from nearby patches of lupin survive, recolonize the lupin that pops up after the fire. And provides habitat for that little brown butterfly up there, the frosted elephant. So not only are we managing to, does our management actually kill the thing we're trying, individuals that we're, of the populations we're trying to protect, but we're also, with some of these other species that we use as indicators, have to collect them and kill them and pin them. In this case, this is Dylan's bee collection, but also ants and moths and some butterflies. And we work with a variety, both in-house and working with academic partners, to try and evaluate how healthy the system is. And again, that means we have to actually collect and kill some individuals. We also do a lot of bird banding that you've probably heard about. And again, this is also to help us understand the health of the system. But bird banding means that we're putting up nets and catching, and I would say, I can't say person handling the butterflies or the birds, catching them in nets, stuffing them in these bags, bringing them back to the banding station, putting a band on their leg, weighing them. Frequently in the summer, we're drawing blood and taking other feather samples from them, putting a unique leg band on them and setting them free. How ethical is that? So again, right, we're catching and stressing wildlife out of necessity to try and understand the influence of what we're doing on the ground for those very birds. And then, of course, we do a good deal of monitoring. We worked with Cornell to evaluate what people think of all this work and the level of support we have, and then utilize that information to try and improve our education and outreach. But in this case, Sarah Nyman from Cornell looked at people's attitudes about management practices and found out we had a surprising amount of support for burning and dealing with invasive species, but less support for cutting trees and mowing. And that tells us something about what we need to do to improve our education and outreach about why we're cutting and mowing. But again, I threw this in here because the ethics is about balance and balancing ecosystem needs with human needs. And part of understanding and managing human needs and maintaining that balance is understanding where people are at with the work that we're doing on the ground, especially the stuff that's controversial, like burning and cutting trees. I talked about some of these questions before. Outstanding questions for us are trying to figure out how much of those various successional variants we need. We're still trying to really nail down what the maintenance fire regime is. So to maintain these sites, how often do they need to be burned, and with what kind of fire and when? Fire effects vary by season, so we're curious about how climate change might influence our ability to burn and when we can burn. And we're thinking increasingly in the face of climate change about the future role of the preserve. In particular, we are at the southern terminus of Cardinal Blues Range. No matter what we do, climate change could still wipe them out. Does that mean the preserve has no value? I would hope not, realizing not only the barrens themselves are worth protecting, but also the pine barrens and the pine bush are going to probably be an important place for species in the future that currently live down by Jody in Tennessee. There are lots of pine barrens along the southeastern coastal plain. With in the face of climate change, some of those species are going to need to move either by themselves or with our help, and they're going to need places to go. So there is the reality that in the future, one of the roles of the Pine Bush Preserve may be as a recipient site for species that are at jeopardy farther south. So in conclusion, aspiring to try and conserve a thing the right way, as Elder Leopold described, is really complicated, especially if we're trying to do it ethically. And some other quotes here from Leopold. San County Almanac is kind of my Bible, but all things evolve, all ethics so far evolved, rest upon a single premise, that the individual is a member of a community of parts, of interconnected parts. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of that community to include soil, water, plants, and animals, and collectively the land. In short, A land ethic changes the role of people from conqueror of the land to a member and citizen of it. I can't read my final thing because I moved you all down. Yeah, actually, because he talks about, in San County Almanac, he talks about the thing. And the thing he's talking about philosophically is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. And he didn't mean this just from the perspective of conservation. He also meant this from the perspective of protecting ourselves and our own ability to live comfortably on this planet. And ultimately, our ability to live comfortably on this planet depends on our ability to preserve the stability of the biotic community and that we're a part of it. So a thing is wrong when it tends not to do that. Acknowledge our funders, states, the feds, preserve staff, and of course, volunteers like you all. And that is what I had prepared. I'm sorry if I went a little bit long. Steve and Jody know I get off on tangents pretty easily. But I'm hoping that you guys will challenge some of what we're doing or that you've been thinking about it and will ask about the pros and cons of the ethics of some of this work. Do you all have any questions?
All right, I'll go first.
All right.
Are you doing any sort of monitoring when you do controlled burns? How many animals are dying as a result? Is there any way to measure that? I realize with insects, I'm guessing not, but are you able to see with mammals or reptiles?
Typically not, because if
what the loss is?
Your first part of your question was, do we monitor and measure that? So one of the things that Tyler does after every burn is walk the unit looking for evidence of any wildlife that was injured or killed as a result of the fire. Occasionally he'll find a snake or a rabbit, but typically wildlife has a way of getting out of the way of fire. Or if they did, particularly for insects and birds, if they died in the fire, there wouldn't be any evidence left after the fire. So what he does, we do look, but I guess the ethics of that, Jody, excuse me, we know that it happens. Part of the ethical calculation for us is that, one, we're managing for populations. So we certainly were in that picture in the background right there. We killed lots of carnival butterflies, as an example, and frosted elephants. So but we balance that with we're trying to manage for the population. So the population won't persist unless we're doing this management, but that management requires actually tools that will kill individuals. So it's not that we don't care about individuals, but we're ultimately trying to ensure the population persists. So that's kind of the ethical balancing act there. Sure. So we do that by making sure we leave refuge. So in this picture, there's refuges within the burn unit, but we're also, as you know, we only typically burn relatively small, discrete areas relative to the size of the preserve. So we're not just for carnivores, but for other wildlife as well. We're always being conscientious of trying not to burn too much too fast in any one area, so that the remnant population of all of the wildlife is high enough that they can repopulate the habitat after we burn it, after it regrows.
Yep.
But it's a constant balancing act.
I was just curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. And particularly with kids, because they don't understand the concepts of individuals and populations as much. So it can be. Good question. Anybody else? I know Campbell's got some burning questions. He's just reserving them for
Neil?
bird banding tomorrow morning.
Yeah, Neil, I have a question. Did the Native Americans do any prescribed burning in this area or not?
We believe they did. There's not a whole lot of, well, there's some evidence. There are historical records from the early colonists of the barrens burning frequently. And it's written that, I forget whose journal it was, that the Native Americans, used to, so colonists were sailing the Hudson River, commenting how in Albany, the Native Americans would burn the hills around the river almost annually. And around the globe, indigenous people have utilized prescribed fire for thousands and thousands.
Yeah, I know in California they used it a lot, so I was just
Yeah,
curious.
out west. And Stephen J. Pine argues that every place he's looked and studied indigenous people and their past land management practices, there's a common denominator of their use of fire in wildlands for a variety of reasons. Whether it's, right, they didn't have bullets and guns, so they were hunting with bows and arrows and spears. You can't throw a bow, you can't shoot an arrow or throw a spear right through a scrub oak thicket or through a forest. So it increases fruit production of berry producing plants like huckleberries, blueberries, raspberries. And one of the things we learned with feeding carner caterpillars in the lab, lupin that resprouts after a fire is actually more nutritious because fire is recycling nutrients. And the carners that were fed lupin from a recent burn site, the resulting adult butterflies laid a lot more eggs, which makes sense if you think about it from a nutrition perspective. You eat better, you're healthier, you can afford to have more babies. But yeah, good question. Scott, did you have a question?
Yeah. A couple of them, Neil. Thanks. One is both the smoke, particulate matter from the fire, and also how that may affect air pollution. And two, you talked about climate change. What about the CO2 that's released from the burn? How's all that weighed and balanced?
So part of it is about how much and how often we put smoke in the air. So in the short term, of course, the air quality, it's smoke, right? I mean, there's no two ways about it. It's smoke. So the air quality, hello, kitty. The air quality of in the smoke column during a burn, of course, is going to be poorer than the air quality than where there's no smoke. And we mitigate that by burning small areas. We burn them pretty mildly. We burn them only in days when there's really good lift. So the smoke is lifting up and away from people, from roads, houses, developments, businesses, that kind of thing. And the other part of that is the climate change question. Again, it's about how much we're putting up. But also with the CO2, there have been a number of studies done that showed that in these kinds of systems that are shrub and grass dominated, as long as we're giving the sites 2, 3, 4 years of regrowth following fire, they're sequestering more carbon than we're releasing with the burn. So it's a net positive, especially prairie grasses and the shrubs like scrub oak are storing an awful lot in their roots that we're not tapping when we burn. So we are releasing CO2 in the air, but it's a net balance as long as we're providing enough time for those plants to regrow and then resequester that CO2 out of the atmosphere. Of course, globally, we're removing more of that more vegetation than we did in the past. So there is a global balance there, and so that the ethical part of that for us is it's multidimensional. So one, it's nice to know in the short term we're having a net balancing act with our managing CO2 from our fires. We have good science to show us that that's what's happening, and we're managing short-term smoke impacts from individual burns. But it's multidimensional in one. Part of the reason why we burn is not just ecological, but it's also about fuels management and managing for trying to prevent big catastrophic wildfires. Fire in pine barrens, if we're going to maintain these sites as barrens, it's as inevitable and essential as rain and sunshine. It's going to happen. So the ethical choice we have is, well, we can just let fires run their course when they hit, which obviously we can't do, or we can try and burn under controlled conditions where we can manage how much smoke and CO2 we're putting up in the air. Wildfires, as you see now out west, wildfires don't tend to happen when conditions are mild or moderate, right? When nature burns things, it burns things on the extreme end. So Native Americans knew this, and they were burning under more moderate conditions, I would assume. I mean, my God, much like the wildlife that's out there, they were really in tune with the system in a way that we could only hope to be. But catastrophic fires that occur during extreme weather and climate events like droughts are going to produce ridiculous amounts of smoke that will affect, it's a lot more smoke at one time, so that's going to affect air quality in a bigger way. It's not going to be controlled. Typically, those fires happen when it's windy, so it's going to be blowing that smoke wherever the smoke wants to blow it. So it is going to impact people. And they release so much carbon all at once that you lose that balance. They burn so hot, they burn so much of the available material that's out there, it can take decades to resequester all that carbon. And that's one of the big problems with the catastrophic mega fires out west right now, and all the burning in the Amazon in South America, is that it's releasing so much carbon so quickly that it's really altering the global balance, the global carbon balance. We can't necessarily manage the global carbon balance ourselves in Albany. We're trying to manage this global ecosystem that depends on fire and do it in a way that minimizes our contributions to climate change. It also means that other commission operations are that much more cognizant and aware of their carbon footprint. So we can offset, we still have a responsibility to the global carbon balance. So we've got solar panels, we have hybrid vehicles, and hopefully over time, energy and water conservation, all that stuff. And we're going to be doing more and more of that kind of sustainability to try and ensure that as an organization, we're minimizing our carbon footprint. Good question. It's highly complicated. But I think we're doing the right thing. I hope Aldo Leopold would think we're doing the right thing. How are we doing, Jody?
We're good. Does anybody else have questions for Neil? Neil, one thing, I'll go ahead and be another one. One thing you didn't address was hunting.
Yeah.
I know that's extremely controversial and something that a lot of people from the general public have questions about, just that rationale of it's a preserve.
Right.
You're allowing people to take things from it. And I know it's a DEC piece involved too, but would you want to speak to that at all?
The DEC piece is just it's a convenient scapegoat. to some degree. And I'm a hunter. So I enjoy hunting for the same reason I enjoy gardening, because there's only a couple of ways that you can truly become connected with the environment and nature in a way that where you're truly a piece and a part of what's going on. But hunting is allowed. We need hunting in the preserve, actually, particularly for the herbivores, in particular for white-tailed deer, because we don't have the predator population necessary to keep that deer population low enough so that they're not negatively impacting all these other rare species of wildlife. It used to be that a patch of lupin, like you see in that photograph, once it blooms, the deer would find it and it would be a salad. And they would go through and consume all the flower heads, eliminating seed production and eating a bunch of coners and frosted elephants in the process. Woodchuck population used to be also very, very high. So hunting is necessary for us, particularly for white-tailed deer, in helping us manage the preserve, so that the population of deer doesn't get too high and negatively affect other things that we care about and that we're managing for. And historically, right, you would have had native people hunting here, but also more predators managing those wildlife populations. The reason DEC utilizes hunting, DEC uses hunting as a wildlife management tool, because we don't have predator populations that would have been here historically, keeping prey populations in check. But it's a delicate balance, and it is controversial.
Do we know how large the take is?
Only for the county. The numbers we get from the DEC that are from are county based and to some degree town based. So it's not a lot. It's a few hundred animals a year.
Well, there's deer strikes on the road.
Right. Yep. No, it's one of the downsides of having a 3,000 acre preserve with no fences is that we can't control access to know who's coming and going, in particular when it comes to hunting. So if you have the wildlife management unit is big, it's bigger than the preserve. So we don't have any way of knowing how many people are out there hunting or what they're taking outside of the reports that DEC provides. And that's only, for the honest hunters that shoot a deer and report it. But it's a metric. Good question, Jody. I'm curious and I know, well, maybe I don't know. I'm just curious what you guys think of some of the wildlife work we do where we're killing and pinning animals and catching and banding birds and stressing them out. Does that strike you as being at all potentially unethical? Okay. I suspected not with this crowd. With the college group, I got a lot of questions about that. They were really freaked out. They were alarmed, justifiably alarmed from a novice's perspective about the fact that we were handling and killing individuals and stressing animals out with the birds, in particular with bird banding, to the degree that we do. But again, it's the ends justify the means, and we try and be ethical with the birds and gentle with them and set them free unharmed, which happens 99.999% of the time.
I'll throw a question out there for you.
Go for it, Steve.
What do you tell people? What do you tell people that are upset that we're cutting down forests and we're losing forest habitat? Like, aren't we losing all the animals that are associated with forests? Isn't that a bad thing?
Yeah, I try and give them, again, my answer always revolves around striking the right balance. There's actually more forest in New York State and in the Northeast today than there was 70, 80, 100 years ago. There is significantly less of these early successional young forest habitats in pine barrens. And the species that depend on the pine barrens are in much more dire need for conservation than forest animals. Not that forest animals aren't also in need of conservation attention, but I try and give them a sense of the equivalency and the urgency needed for pine barrens and pine barrens wildlife. Because ultimately it's a balancing act. But all things in nature are, right? Does that make sense? Okay, I can see Bob nodding his head. Scott looks quizzical. Okay.
Yeah, my granddad used to complain. We came back to Kentucky when I first moved out east, where my granddad was from, and he was complaining because the hills were all in forest. When he was a kid, they farmed them.
Yeah. Looked a lot different.
Yeah, he felt too closed in with all the trees right around the hollers there.
Neil, talking about the carbon footprint. I'm trying to reduce carbon footprint by, I have a battery electric car and I'm getting my electric power from wind, which is the major source of power in New York State. How can I reduce my natural gas consumption? How can I get National Grid to provide geothermal to me?
I can't answer that question, Richard.
Yeah.
It sounds like you have a mind for the kinds of things that you can do. In addition to what you already talked about, all the energy conservation things that you can do in your home.
Yeah.
LED bulbs, insulation, ceiling windows, all of that.
Yep, all that stuff.
Yeah, and buying your energy right. I know Campbell does as well. Buys his energy. The energy he gets from grid is renewable. It's wind and solar.
Yep.
And for me here on our farm, we have pretty much 100% of our electricity comes from our own solar array.
Mm-hmm.
I drive a hybrid car. I drive a Prius.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's lots of little things. And while we as individuals may not have a huge impact on that carbon footprint, we set an example through our activities.
Yep.
So there are a lot more people doing it now than used to be. And hopefully we're going to see an awful lot more of push for sustainable energy.
Yep.
Any other questions for Neil while we've got him?
I guess, Richard, we all should do everything we can do, right? For sustainability. We can't all do everything, but we all should do everything we can do.
Everything we can do, yeah. Yeah.
Well, Jody, thank you for the opportunity to do this tonight. This presentation is still a bit of a work in progress. I'm curious. I'd love to get feedback on whether or not you think I need to be more explicit in trying to build in questions of ethics as it goes, or is it enough to leave it open-ended and talk about what we're doing and pose questions? What do you all think? Should I be more obvious with the ethics?
I don't think so. I think the emphasis was just right, Neil.
Thanks, Richard.
So say obviously an audience of volunteers who already have, you know, the background that these volunteers have is different than if you're presenting to the public or a college group. So that's the tricky part.
I mean, I think you dropped breadcrumbs as you were presenting. You'd say something. You'd talk about the ethics of it as you went. That's sort of to plant the seeds for the discussion afterwards. So I think you did both.
Good. Well, thank you all for spending the last hour plus with me on a Thursday evening in October. Took us a couple of tries between glitches and weather and servers going down, but I'm glad that you guys were able to join us tonight, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the preserve.
Thanks,
Thank
Neil.
you very much, Neil.